My name is David Clark, and I gave my son everything a father possibly could. My time, my sweat, my dreams, and every cent I ever earned. I buried my own wants to raise him after his mother passed. But nothing prepared me for the day he looked me in the eye and said, "You're nothing to us," before throwing me out of the very house I built for him. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I walked out into the cold rain with nothing but a suitcase and a faded photo of his mother. People said I was finished. They whispered that I'd been used and discarded, but they had no idea what I was carrying in that envelope inside my coat pocket. Before we begin this story, I want to ask, where are you watching from and how old are you? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Subtle Revenge Stories for more deeply personal stories like this one. You're nothing to us. That was the sentence, cold, sharp, and final. Liam didn't yell it. He didn't need to. His voice was calm, too calm, and that made it hurt even more. I stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by furniture I helped him buy, walls I'd painted, and light fixtures I'd installed with my own hands. My fingers gripped the handle of my suitcase, the same one I'd used on family trips when he was a boy. Now it held just a few shirts and a faded photo of his mother. That was all I had left that mattered. Liam stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, polished shoes, tapping impatiently on the hardwood. "You think we owe you something?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, like he genuinely didn't understand the weight of what he was saying. Olivia, his wife, sat on the white leather sofa like royalty overseeing a banishment. Her arms were crossed, her legs elegantly tucked under her, and a smug smile played at the corners of her lips. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. The look in her eyes said everything. This was her idea. She'd gotten into his ear twisted. His thinking made him believe that love from a father was a transaction. I scanned the room one last time. The chandelier overhead, the wine stain on the rug from last Thanksgiving, the floor-to-ceiling windows I'd insisted on when we renovated. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a museum of betrayal. I looked at Liam and said quietly, "I gave you everything." My voice trembled, and I hated that. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cracked. He shrugged his wedding ring, catching the light. "And I'm done carrying you. It's time for you to go." He pointed to the door, as if I were some tenant being evicted. Olivia didn't flinch, but I saw it, a twitch in her hand, a flicker of hesitation. Not guilt, but fear. She knew I wasn't as weak as I looked. I thought about reminding Liam of the nights I stayed up to rock him to sleep. The mornings I packed his lunches after Mary passed, the birthdays I spent half my paycheck on, just to see him smile. But what good would it do now? That boy was gone. In his place stood a man with a mortgage, a luxury car, and no memory of love that wasn't useful. I turned slowly, pulling my coat tighter around me as I walked to the door. My chest felt heavy, not with regret, but with something else, something harder. I paused at the threshold, rain already lashing against the glass. "You're wrong about me," I said, without turning around. Neither of them responded. I stepped out into the storm, the wind biting through my coat, the rain soaking my shoes. The door slammed behind me, loud and final. I had no plan, no destination, and no one waiting for me. But as I stood in that cold darkness, a thought rose above the heartbreak. Maybe I didn't need anyone else. Maybe for the first time in years, I needed to find out who I was without them. The rain didn't let up that night. I walked for what felt like hours, my suitcase dragging behind me, wheels catching in sidewalk cracks and puddles. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional blur of headlights slicing through the downpour. No one stopped. No one looked twice at the soaked old man on the corner of 5th and Glencoe. I didn't blame them. I wouldn't have either. Eventually, I ended up in Lent, the part of Portland that people like Liam and Olivia avoided unless they were driving through with the doors locked. I didn't care. I just needed 4 walls, a roof, and silence. I found a studio apartment behind a nail salon. The landlord didn't ask questions. Cash only. I handed over 2 crumpled bills and signed a lease on a clipboard that smelled faintly of bleach. The room was small, a twin bed sagging in the middle, a wobbly table near the cracked window, a ceiling bulb that flickered like it couldn't decide whether to stay alive. It smelled like old coffee and mildew, but it was mine at least for now. I sat on the edge of the mattress, water pooling on the floor beneath me. My coat stuck to my back, cold and damp. My hands ached from the chill. I didn't even have the strength to take my shoes off. I opened the suitcase. Inside, the contents looked pitiful. 2 shirts, a pair of slacks, the framed photo of Mary, and an envelope so old its corners had curled. I took out the photo first. Mary's smile was just as I remembered it, gentle, warm, filled with quiet strength. Liam stood beside her, maybe 6 years old, grinning with jam smeared on his cheek. I traced their faces with my thumb, and something inside me cracked. Not from pain, but from memory. The kind that stings because it used to feel like home. After Mary died in 1995, I told Liam I'd protect him, raise him right, keep him safe. And I did. I worked construction in the rain, in the heat on holidays. I turned down promotions that required travel so I could be there to pick him up after school. I gave up my weekends, my savings, even my dreams of Europe. And I never once regretted it. Until tonight. I remembered the bills I used to hide from him, folding them neatly under phone books so he wouldn't worry. The ramen dinners I dressed up with frozen peas and called budget pasta night. The way I'd kiss his forehead when he fell asleep in the living room watching cartoons. I remembered it all with aching clarity. And yet here I was alone in a room smaller than the walk-in closet in the house I gave him. The same house he threw me out of. My eyes settled on the envelope again. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just held it. The paper felt heavier now, like it had waited all these years for this exact moment. Something told me it mattered more than I could understand. So I set it aside, crawled into the creaky bed, and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally found me. Somewhere between the flicker of that dying bulb and the ache in my chest, I made a silent promise I wasn't finished. The next morning came gray and silent. The rain had eased, but a mist clung to the windows like a film of memory that wouldn't wipe away. I sat at the table sipping coffee from a chipped mug left behind by the last tenant. It was bitter and burnt, but it was warm, and that was enough. I stared out at the cracked alleyway beyond the glass, wondering how 30 years of fatherhood could disappear with one sentence. The words still echoed in my ears. You're nothing to us. I didn't know if it was Liam's voice or Olivia's influence, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth was, I'd handed them the knife and turned my back. I thought of the house again, the stairs I rebuilt after Liam fell down them at 8, the porch swing Mary had picked out before she passed the fireplace I installed, so he'd never feel cold in winter. Every inch of that place had a piece of me in it, not just in labor but in love. I hadn't just given him a house. I'd given him a home. And when I signed the deed over to him 5 years ago, I told myself it was an act of love. I wanted him to have stability, a future. What I didn't realize was that I was also handing over a piece of myself, and he was more than willing to throw it out when it no longer served him. I got up, walked to the suitcase still sitting in the corner, and pulled out the envelope again. I didn't open it. I wasn't ready. But I kept it close like a secret I hadn't decided to trust yet. I tucked it into the drawer under the table and let my fingers linger on it a moment longer than necessary. Something about it reminded me of a promise I'd made a long time ago to myself and to Mary, that I wouldn't let the world take from me without a fight. The rest of the day was quiet. I wandered down the block to a corner store, picked up a few cans of soup, a loaf of bread, and some instant coffee. The clerk barely looked at me. That was fine. I didn't want to be seen yet. Back at the apartment, I pulled the plastic wrap off the loaf with careful hands, each movement deliberate as if speed would break me. I ate in silence, chewing more out of habit than hunger. The solitude settled in like dust, thick and slow, coating every surface of my thoughts. Later, I found myself digging through a worn notebook I used to keep in the garage. It was filled with quotes Mary had jotted down over the years, little bits of wisdom she'd liked. One caught my eye. Sometimes the hardest part of the storm is surviving long enough to rebuild. I read it 3 times, letting it sink in. I hadn't been thrown out. I'd been set free. They didn't realize it, but they'd done me a favor. I closed the notebook, lit the single lamp by the bed, and sat down again. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew this: if they thought I was going to disappear quietly, they were wrong. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. A week passed in silence, broken only by the occasional siren in the distance and the soft drip from the kitchen faucet that I never bothered fixing. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't answer the phone. Liam had called twice. I watched his name flash on the screen and let it fade into nothing. He could keep his apologies if that's what they were. I didn't want words anymore. Words were what broke me in the first place. What I needed now was something solid, something real, something that couldn't be twisted or denied. On the 7th day, I walked to the Portland Public Library. It wasn't far, just a few blocks through cold air and morning drizzle. The warmth inside was jarring, at first quiet, clean-ordered. It smelled like old paper and worn carpet, like a place where things still mattered. I wandered past shelves of books until I found a corner table near a window, and I sat down. I didn't know what I was looking for, not really. But I had a feeling it was here. I started with real estate law. Dry stuff. Paragraphs thick with legalese clauses that bled into each other. But I kept reading. I took notes on a legal pad I borrowed from the reference desk. My handwriting jagged, rushed. There had to be something, some crack in the foundation I'd given Liam. 5 years ago, I signed over the deed. I remembered it clearly. I even remembered the pen. But I also remembered a pause, a confusion about one of the documents, a signature that wasn't notarized. At the time, the lawyer brushed it off. Now I wasn't so sure. My pen scratched across the paper as I flipped pages, my back stiff, my neck sore, but I didn't stop. Hours passed. The sky outside turned from gray to darker gray. Somewhere around late afternoon, a woman's voice broke through the quiet. "You look like you're either solving a murder or planning one." I looked up, surprised. She was in her mid-50s, maybe early 60s. Her hair was pulled back, her coat still damp from the rain. She held a thick book and raised an eyebrow. I smiled slightly. "Maybe a little of both," I said. She walked over and set her book down across from me. "Ellen Marshall," she said, extending a hand. "Lawyer. And you look like you need one." I hesitated. Then something in me loosened. "David Clark," I said, shaking her hand. "I guess I'm trying to figure out how to take my life back." She didn't blink. She pulled out the chair and sat down just like that, as if she'd been waiting for me all along. "Well, David," she said, flipping open her notebook, "why don't we start with what they took from you and then work our way back to what's rightfully yours?" Her voice was calm, confident, without pity. It felt like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a room too long. That afternoon, under the soft hum of library lights and the distant patter of rain against the windows, I began to believe that maybe I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new fight. Ellen and I stayed at that library table long after the daylight faded. She didn't ask many personal questions, and I didn't offer too many answers. But I told her the basics about Liam, the house, the betrayal. I watched her as I spoke. She listened without interrupting, her eyes, steady, pen poised but still. When I finished, she nodded like she'd already known the shape of my story before I spoke a word. "You're not the first father tossed aside by a child who thinks power makes them untouchable," she said. "But I haven't seen one walk in here and start pulling property law like a prize fighter in a minute." Her words made me feel something I hadn't felt in weeks seen. We spent the next few hours poring over local real estate records, filing details, legal procedures. She knew where to look. She explained things I didn't understand without making me feel stupid. That mattered. I told her about the day I signed the house over, how I was grieving, how Liam promised to take care of me. "You signed under duress," she said matter-of-factly. "That's a start." She took out her phone and snapped a photo of one of the records. "You still have the original deed," I nodded. "Then we might have more than a start." We moved from the library to a nearby cafe. It was quiet, half empty, the kind of place where no one looked twice at a man with bags under his eyes and a lawyer with too many tabs open on her laptop. Ellen ordered chamomile tea and a blueberry scone. I just sat there sipping the same bitter coffee I'd become used to. "Tell me something," she said as she pulled a legal pad from her bag. Why, now I looked out the window, watching the steam from my breath fog the glass. "Because I gave everything I had, and now I have nothing left but the truth," I said. "And I'm tired of letting people like Olivia rewrite it." She gave a small smile. "Then let's get to work." She started outlining a strategy. Leverage, motive, exposure. We'd gather documentation, review every step of the transfer, comb through public records. We'd find patterns, fraud, coercion, manipulation. And when we had enough, we'd decide what to do next. "People like your son and his wife," she said, "they leave tracks. They're too arrogant to cover their footprints." By the time we wrapped, I felt like my spine had straightened a little. I wasn't strong again yet, not fully. But I could feel something in me hardening into shape. That night I walked home slower, more aware of the air, the sound of my own shoes on the pavement. When I reached the apartment, I went straight to the drawer and pulled out the envelope. I sat with it in my hands, not opening it, just holding it like a lifeline. Maybe it wasn't the deed. Maybe it was something else entirely. But it was mine, untouched, unchanged. A piece of my past that could change my future. For the first time since Liam threw me out, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a man quietly preparing for war. And I wasn't going to fight with fists or fury. I was going to fight with facts, paper, and patience. That was something they didn't expect. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The air in the apartment was cold, still, and damp. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat at the table with a cup of instant coffee, staring at the envelope again. I hadn't opened it. I didn't need to yet. What mattered now was building the foundation of something stronger than anger. Ellen had given me direction, but the fire had to come from me. I wasn't just trying to reclaim a house, I was reclaiming my name. The library became my second home. I spent every morning under the same flickering light at the back corner table. The librarian started nodding at me with the kind of recognition that doesn't require small talk. I liked that. I didn't want pity. I wanted focus. Ellen joined me when she could. Other times she sent PDFs and notes through secure messages. She warned me to stay off personal devices. People like Olivia don't just hire lawyers, they hire watchers. I learned fast, faster than I thought possible. Contracts, filings, power of attorney clauses, quiet title actions. I read case after case, underlining phrases I didn't fully understand, then decoding them line by line. The more I read, the angrier I became, but it was a clean anger, sharp and cool. The kind you could build a case on. Every legal misstep we uncovered was like turning over a stone and finding a weakness crawling underneath. Liam's name started showing up in forums, whispered complaints from clients of his real estate firm, inflated property values, sketchy appraisals. One post caught my eye. Someone accused him of ghosting after a deal fell through, taking thousands in consulting fees with no refund. Ellen said, "We can work with this." She made me see it all differently. This wasn't just personal. This was systemic. Liam didn't just betray me, he exploited trust wherever he found it. We made a list of names, former clients, business associates, anyone who might talk. We didn't reach out, not yet, but we gathered patterns, emails, addresses. Ellen's network helped confirm a few tips. One man, Marcus Reed, had already filed a complaint against Liam's firm with the state licensing board. "He's your crack in the wall," Ellen said. "You apply pressure there and things start to split." I started to see it, how Liam built his image on polished suits and forced charm. But underneath, he was careless. And Olivia, for all her poise, was obsessed with reputation. Ellen pointed that out quickly. She doesn't fear truth. She fears humiliation. That was our advantage. We didn't need to shout. We just needed to whisper in the right corners and wait for the echo. That night, back at the apartment, I took out a notepad and wrote one sentence at the top: "I am not broken." Then I underlined it twice. I taped it to the wall above my table. Every morning afterward, I read it aloud before opening my books. Liam thought he'd erased me. Olivia thought she'd replaced me. But I was still here. And I was learning how to fight on a battlefield they didn't even see coming. Days passed, and each one brought new fragments of information. Ellen and I met in small cafes and quiet library corners, always changing spots, always discreet. She carried her notes in a battered leather satchel, always close to her side like it held something holy. I brought my yellow notepad and the same pen I'd used for years at the construction site, thick, worn, and familiar in my hand. There was comfort in the routine, but beneath it, pressure was building. One Thursday afternoon, as the rain hammered Portland's sidewalks, Ellen slid her laptop across the table and turned the screen toward me. "Look at this," she said. On the screen was a social media post from Olivia's company, an elegant shot from a charity gala. Olivia stood center stage in a red dress, smiling like a statue. Ellen zoomed in on the caption: "Marketing Director Olivia Clark honored for leadership." I stared at it hollow. Read the comments, she said. Dozens of them. Most were fluff congratulations, praise, but one caught my eye. A username I didn't recognize wrote, "Wonder if they knew about the private fund allocations." It had no likes, no replies. But it was there. A whisper. Ellen tapped the screen. "That's our next string to pull." She was right. Olivia had always been meticulous in public. Composed. Stylish. The type of person who could smile at your face while setting a trap behind your back. But if she was sloppy behind closed doors, if she'd blurred lines with corporate accounts, we could use that. Not to destroy her outright, but to knock her off balance. And a woman like Olivia didn't fall gracefully. She cracked. The deeper we dug, the more threads we found. Payments tucked into vague line items, travel expenses filed under research, a personal spa visit, bundled into a team retreat. It wasn't criminal yet, but it was enough to warrant attention. "We don't need fire," Ellen said. "Just enough smoke to make people nervous." At home, I drafted the letter. I used a public library computer, wiped the history, sent it through an anonymous email account. The message was crisp, professional, and laced with just enough detail to make Olivia's firm wonder if someone inside was leaking. I didn't mention names. I didn't have to. Ellen read it twice before I sent it and nodded. "It's surgical. That's what we need." After I hit send, I stared at the screen for a long time. It felt like pulling a trigger in a quiet room. The silence afterward was deafening. I walked home in a downpour, drenched by the time I reached my building. But I didn't care. I felt clean for the first time in weeks. I wasn't lashing out. I was setting things in motion. And that was a different kind of power. Later that night, as I sat with a bowl of canned soup and the soft creak of the radiator behind me, I thought about Mary. I imagined her voice calm and warm, telling me I was doing the right thing. I reached for the envelope again, still sealed, still waiting. It wasn't time yet, but I could feel it. That moment was coming, and when it did, I'd be ready. By the end of that week, the shift was noticeable. Olivia's firm released a vague internal memo about routine budget reviews. It was buried at the bottom of a local business newsletter, but Ellen found it within hours. "She's rattled." Ellen said, her voice low, as we sat in a quiet booth of a diner that smelled like coffee grounds and vinyl. "They don't announce budget reviews unless they're worried someone's already looking." I nodded, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug. "Good," I said, but the word came out colder than I expected. It didn't feel like victory. Not yet. It felt like pressure, like the slow tightening of a net we hadn't finished weaving. We kept pushing. Ellen tracked down records from Liam's company, Clark Realty. Through state databases and public complaints, we began stitching together a trail. One name surfaced more than once: Marcus Reed, a former client, the man who'd posted on the forum about being misled. Ellen managed to find his contact info buried in a small claims filing. She didn't reach out yet, but she flagged it. "He's our entry point. If he talks, we've got precedent." I took a breath and wrote his name at the top of my pad, then underlined it slowly. Marcus Reed, a stranger, but maybe the key. Back in the apartment, I cleared the table and laid out everything we'd gathered so far. Articles, records, notes, lines drawn with highlighters and arrows like battle strategies. I stared at them for hours. I wasn't just reclaiming my home. I was unmasking two people who'd taken more than bricks and beams. They'd taken my worth, my identity, my place in the family. And now they were going to feel what I felt when the door slammed shut behind me. Still, a part of me wrestled with doubt. He was my son. I remembered Liam as a boy hugging my leg at Mary's funeral, whispering he didn't want me to die too. I remembered reading him bedtime stories, making pancakes in the shape of dinosaurs, rushing to every school play, even when work ran late. Was this man the same person? Or had Olivia shaped him into something I couldn't recognize, I didn't know? And at this point, I couldn't afford to care. That night, the envelope weighed heavier in the drawer. I pulled it out again and just looked at it under the soft lamplight. It had aged with me. Yellowed, worn at the corners, the seal barely holding. I didn't open it, but I knew what it was: the original deed. The one signed with a technical flaw. The one Liam never followed through to record properly. I'd suspected it. Ellen confirmed it. It was my fail-safe, the final card, the clean blade waiting to cut through their arrogance. I slid it back into the drawer carefully and locked it. Not yet. The time would come, but it had to be precise. That was the game we were playing now, calculated moves, surgical strikes. Olivia feared scandal. Liam feared collapse. And I was no longer afraid of either. For the first time in my life, I was learning how to fight without losing myself in the process. And that, more than anything, was the start of real justice. 2 days later, I woke up to my phone vibrating on the table. No name, just a number. I let it ring. It rang again an hour later, still unlisted. I turned it off. I didn't like the way my chest felt tight, hollow, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I sat still for a while, listening to the silence. Something had shifted. I didn't know what, but I could feel it, like the moment before thunder breaks. Later that day, Ellen called and asked me to meet her at a park. Not the library, not the diner, a park. That alone told me enough. The wind was sharp when I got there, carrying the bite of early November. Leaves skittered across the cracked path like tiny messengers. Ellen sat on a weathered bench, her coat-buttoned high scarf loose around her neck and a notebook on her lap. She didn't look up when I approached. "He's hired someone," she said flatly. "A private investigator, tall guy, lean, not subtle. He was sitting at the corner table yesterday when I left the cafe." I didn't respond. I felt the muscles in my back tighten. "Are you sure it's him?" She nodded. "He watched me, didn't even try to hide it. That's not just curiosity. That's intimidation." I looked out over the empty playground, the rusted swings creaking in the wind. "Then they're nervous," I said. "Good." Ellen turned toward me. "David, nervous people make reckless choices, dangerous choices. We have to be careful now." Her tone wasn't panicked, but it was sharp, focused. "No more public computers, no open Wi-Fi. Don't use your real name anywhere." I nodded. My mind was already racing. I thought about the envelope in my drawer, the deed, my weapon. But it wasn't time yet. They were sniffing around because the pressure was working. That meant we were close. But it also meant the next move had to be exact. We walked a loop around the park, our shoes crunching on fallen leaves. "My ex-husband hired someone too," Ellen said quietly. "During our divorce. Thought he'd find something to shame me in court. He didn't. But it still made me sleep with the lights on for a month." I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. "I'm sorry you had to live through that." She shrugged. "You learn how to carry fear like a second coat. It's heavy, but you stop noticing after a while." We stopped near the edge of the park where the wind died down. Ellen looked at me hard. "If they come after you directly, phone calls, visits, you call me. You don't answer. You don't let them inside. You're not alone in this, David." Her words sat in my chest long after we parted ways. Back at the apartment, I checked the locks 3 times. I pulled the shades closed, unplugged the router, and sat down with the deed in my lap. I ran my fingers along the seal, feeling every wrinkle in the paper. Liam and Olivia had made the mistake of underestimating me. But now they were watching. And that meant I'd finally become the threat they never saw coming. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak in the hallway outside my apartment made me flinch. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for footsteps that never came. When the radiator hissed, I jolted. When a car passed outside with its headlights off, I held my breath. It was irrational maybe, but fear doesn't care about reason. It shows up when you know too much, when you've crossed a line you can't uncross. And I had. I'd started a war, and even though my weapons were words and paper, they were drawing blood. In the morning, I did what I always did. Now walked to the library with my notebook under one arm and my coat zipped tight. I sat in my usual corner facing the entrance. Ellen met me an hour later, her steps more cautious than before. She wore sunglasses indoors, not for style, but to see without being seen. We didn't speak right away. She pulled out a folded paper and slid it across the table. They're preparing to file something. Probably a preemptive suit defamation harassment. They're going to paint you as unstable. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her and said, "Let them." She smiled just slightly. That's the right answer. But we still need to be smarter than them. We sketched out our next phase. We would reinforce the legality of the original deed review, every timestamp, every signature, every procedural failure in the house transfer. We didn't just want to respond, we wanted to strike. Ellen pulled out a second sheet, this one listing Liam's recent transactions. His firm was losing clients. The anonymous tips, the internal reviews, they were spreading like cracks across glass. But it was Olivia who showed signs of unraveling. Her firm had suspended travel reimbursements pending review. Her name was removed from a press release. Nothing public yet, but the tremors had started. Ellen circled a date. If we time the next move around her firm's board meeting, we can hit the pressure point just right. Later that evening, I sat alone in the apartment, the heat barely keeping up with the cold pressing in from the window panes. I pulled out my notebook and flipped through the pages. I reread the note I'd taped to the wall, "I am not broken." But something had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was reclaiming space, mental, emotional, even physical. Every document I read, every line I highlighted, was part of rebuilding a self they thought they had erased. I thought about the look on Liam's face the night he threw me out. Not anger, not even guilt. Just certainty. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to cut off the man who raised him. And I thought about Olivia standing behind him, like a shadow with teeth. They didn't understand what it meant to tear someone down who had already lost everything. They thought they were dealing with weakness, but what they were really facing was clarity. Before going to bed, I lit the small desk lamp and held the envelope again. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. It wasn't time. But it was coming. And when it did, I wouldn't knock on the door, they closed in my face. I'd walk through it like it had always been mine, because it was. The summons came on a Tuesday. Thick envelope. No return address. My name printed in bold all caps like it belonged to someone else. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it while the radiator clicked in the background, and the afternoon light carved pale lines across the floor. Eventually, I slid a knife under the seal and unfolded the pages slowly, one by one. Lawsuit. Defamation. They accused me of spreading falsehoods with malicious intent, emotional distress, damage to reputation. It was exactly what Ellen had warned me about. It was also exactly what I expected. They thought they could bury me with paperwork. They thought the weight of their accusations would send me retreating into silence. But I'd lived through the loss of a wife, the slow erosion of a son's love, and a betrayal so casual it could have passed for indifference. Paper didn't scare me anymore. I called Ellen. She picked up on the first ring. "They moved," I said. "It's a bluff," she replied, not missing a beat. "They're scared." She told me to meet her at the library in an hour. When I arrived, she had the summons spread out on the table, already marked with highlighter and notes in the margins. "Look at the wording," she said. "They're framing you as bitter, erratic. This is PR disguised as litigation. We'll counter it." She slid over another sheet. "And we'll do it with this." It was a response draft, sharp, calm, surgical. Not defensive, declarative. Attached to it was the preliminary filing to assert the validity of the original deed. That yellowed contract I kept sealed in my drawer, tucked away like a lifeline, was now our shield and our sword. Ellen had already begun formal documentation of the errors in the title, transfer, the legal gaps in how Liam had assumed ownership, the missing notarization, the inconsistent dates. "We'll file it quietly," she said, "and let the noise catch them off guard." That night, I unlocked the drawer and laid the deed on the table. I stared at the faded ink, the familiar shape of my own signature from 5 years ago. I remembered that day. I remembered the hollow in my chest when I handed it over. I told myself it was for Liam's future. I told myself it was what Mary would have wanted. But now I saw it for what it was, a sacrifice made in blindness. And sacrifices made in blindness are too easily exploited. I smoothed the edges of the paper and placed it in a protective sleeve. It didn't look like much. Just a document, a record. But it was the foundation of everything I had built, everything they tried to erase. I felt something steady settle in my chest, like a weight finally shifting into place. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration, of truth, of worth, of everything they tried to strip from me the moment I walked out of that house with a suitcase and no name. The court date was weeks away, but the fight had already begun. They came at me with noise. I would answer with silence and precision. And when the time was right, I'd let the truth do what it always does. Break the lie apart. In the days that followed, I moved like a man preparing for winter, quiet, methodical, making sure nothing was left vulnerable. I didn't answer unknown calls. I kept the curtains drawn. I spoke to no one except Ellen. We met in different spots now. No pattern, no routine. She'd taught me that. Predictability is a gift to people who want to control the narrative, she said. So we played it loose. A bench in Mont Tabor, a table in the back of a print shop. Once we met in the back of an antique bookstore while a jazz record played on loop. She laid out our path like a general mapping a battlefield. We filed the quiet claim to contest the original transfer of the house. It wouldn't make headlines, but it would send ripples. Liam would hear about it soon enough through a lawyer, a legal notification, or a panicked call from one of his associates. The moment he realized the deed wasn't dead, the illusion of control would crack. Ellen smiled when she handed me the final paperwork. Let them wonder who pulled the thread. But it wasn't just about property anymore. We were pulling records, interviewing potential witnesses, building a narrative not just of legal oversight, but of systemic manipulation documents, where Liam used my name, post-transfer decisions made without full consent, financial transactions that blurred ethical lines. Ellen called it constructive possession. I called it betrayal in a suit. Meanwhile, Olivia's world was starting to buckle. The ethics committee at her firm had opened an internal audit. We knew because a contact of Ellen's, an ex-colleague from her litigation days, slipped a message through a secure channel. Nothing definitive yet, but the storm was circling. I imagined her waking up to unread emails, scheduled calls with nervous accountants, a growing sense that something she couldn't name was unraveling behind the scenes. At home, I started organizing the apartment. Not just papers, but everything. I boxed up old clothes, donated half my books, cleaned the floor with vinegar and hot water. It wasn't about order. It was about readiness, about facing what was coming without chaos at my back. The envelope with the deed now sat in a locked briefcase under the bed, not hidden, protected. Its presence no longer made me anxious. It made me calm. One night I sat at the table with a glass of tap water and stared out into the street. A man walked by and a long coat face shadowed, and I felt that old chill rise up. I didn't move. I just watched. He passed without pause. Just another shape in the fog. But my heartbeat didn't slow for a while. I wasn't afraid, not exactly. But I knew we were no longer playing defense, and the closer we got to the courtroom, the more unpredictable they would become. The war had shifted. It wasn't just about truth now. It was about endurance, about who could stand longer in the silence, who could outlast the fear. And I'd already learned how to live in the dark. I wasn't running. I was waiting. By the third week, the silence broke. Not through the news, not through the court, but through Liam himself. I spotted him outside my building, standing across the street, pretending to scroll on his phone. He wasn't dressed like the man I remembered. The tailored confidence was gone. His collar was uneven, his eyes restless. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. I didn't go out. I didn't wave. I simply stood behind the curtain and watched. He never looked up, but I could feel the weight of his presence pressing against the window, like a hand that wasn't sure if it wanted to knock or smash through. I waited until nightfall to leave. Ellen had told me not to change my habits, but I moved more deliberately now. I kept to well-lit streets, watched my surroundings like I was back on a job site inspecting scaffolding after a storm. At the cafe, she was already there, tapping her pen against her legal pad, the way she did when her mind was spinning faster than her voice could keep up. "He showed up," I said as I sat down. Didn't approach. Just stood there. Ellen didn't blink. "He wants to know how much you know. He's afraid you've already won." I took a sip of coffee, my hand steady. "Have I?" She leaned forward. "You've forced him into reaction mode. That's the first real win." We reviewed the most recent filings. The response to the lawsuit was filed with sharp, deliberate language. Calm. Assertive. Every sentence designed to remind the court that I wasn't a bitter man lashing out. I was a man defending what was rightfully his. Attached were our exhibits, timelines, records, the original deed in its protective sleeve, notarized and stamped for presentation. Ellen's strategy was simple: clarity wins over drama. The more they screamed, the more our silence would speak. But silence came at a cost. Each day felt like holding my breath underwater, waiting to see which ripple would become a wave. I knew Olivia wouldn't handle the pressure well. That was the bet Ellen made early on. Her need for control was her weakness. And Liam, he was unraveling. That much was clear. A few days later, I received an email from a former neighbor. She'd heard rumors that Liam and Olivia were fighting, that Liam was under investigation at work, that Olivia had missed a company meeting and returned in tears. She didn't know the details, only that something big was happening. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled, slow and quiet. This wasn't joy. It was justice creeping in like dawn through a cracked window. Not blinding, just enough to remind me that I wasn't crazy, that love doesn't excuse betrayal. That silence, when used right, becomes the loudest sound in the room. Back at home, I turned on a single lamp and sat at the table. I reached for the notebook and wrote one line: "The cracks are showing." Then I closed the cover, placed it beside the deed, and folded my hands. The storm was circling, but I was calm, because I had built this storm. I didn't hear from Liam again after that day outside my building. No calls, no texts, no more shadowed figures in the street. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace. It felt like strategy. Ellen warned me it was coming. They'll go dark when they don't know what else to do. Silence for them is a form of defense, but it won't hold. And she was right. Because silence only works when it's earned. Mine had purpose. Theirs had panic. News finally broke on a small local blog, Clark Realty named in an ongoing investigation regarding appraisal fraud and falsified renovation invoices. It was a soft release, likely leaked by someone inside to get ahead of something bigger. But it didn't matter. It was public. The headline didn't mention Liam by name, but it didn't have to. Everyone in that circle knew who ran the company. The ripple had begun. Ellen and I met later that evening at a quiet bar tucked behind an art supply store. We sat in a booth under dim lights while a jukebox played low jazz from the corner. She slid a newspaper across the table and pointed to the article. "They're bleeding," she said simply. "And when people bleed, they either retreat or lash out. We need to prepare for both." I nodded and glanced out the window. A couple walked by, laughing under an umbrella untouched by the storm we were in. I envied them for a moment, then let it go. I didn't have room for longing. Not now. Ellen laid out our final motion. We'd attach supplementary evidence to the deed filing emails between Liam and a title officer, showing his lack of follow-through tax documents, where he continued listing me as the homeowner for deduction purposes. "It's tight," she said. "Not just legally, but morally. The judge won't see a bitter father. She'll see a man who trusted his son and was manipulated." That word manipulated stuck with me. I didn't like thinking of myself that way. But it was true. I'd trusted Liam blindly. I'd made excuses for his distance, for Olivia's interference, for the way their voices hardened over the years. I told myself they were busy building lives, doing what young people do. But all the while they were reshaping the story in their favor. And I let them. Not anymore. Later that night, back in my apartment, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside was a small wooden box Mary gave me on our 10th anniversary. I lifted the lid and found a letter she'd written just days before she passed. I'd read it 100 times, but tonight I needed it more than ever. "You gave everything to our son. Don't let the world convince you that makes you weak. You're the strongest man I've ever known." I closed the box gently and placed it beside the deed. This wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was about reclaiming the truth of who I had been all along. I wasn't the man they cast aside. I was the one who built the ground they stood on. And now I was shaking it beneath their feet. The courthouse rose out of the city like something carved from stone and memory. It wasn't grand, just functional. Cold walls, long halls. The kind of place where truth was measured in procedure and silence held more weight than fury. I arrived early, wore my only suit. It was older, tighter in the shoulders than I remembered, but it carried the scent of Mary's cologne faintly in the lapels. I stood outside the front doors for a moment, listening to the rush of traffic and the rustle of leaves scraping across the steps. Then I walked in. Inside, everything was still. The waiting room buzzed with soft voices and shuffling papers. Ellen met me near the security gate. She wore gray, professional, calm, sharp as ever. She didn't say much, just placed her hand briefly on my arm and gave me a nod. That was enough. When we entered the courtroom, Liam and Olivia were already there. He sat at the plaintiff's table, jaw-tight suit, perfect. But his eyes flicked when he saw me like something in him recoiled. Olivia sat beside him composed, but I could see the strain. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. Her foot tapped under her chair. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. Her body already told the story. The judge entered a woman with iron-gray hair and a presence that silenced the room without effort. We all stood, then sat. The proceeding began. Their lawyer spoke first, weaving a narrative of a delusional man desperate for relevance lashing out after voluntarily gifting a house to his son. I listened, without moving, every word meant to bury me deeper. But I'd already been buried once. I'd climbed out of that grave with ink and evidence. When Ellen stood, the air changed. Her voice was measured, but not mechanical. "Your Honor, this case is not about bitterness. It is about facts, and the most important fact is that the legal transfer of this property was never completed. We have documentation of procedural failure, retained ownership, and misuse of authority by the plaintiff. She handed over the sealed envelope. The deed. The paper I had kept folded in a drawer for 5 years. The judge read silently. The courtroom held its breath. I watched Liam, and for the first time I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. Olivia leaned toward him, whispered something sharp. His jaw clenched tighter. Their story was breaking. When the judge spoke again, it was with finality. The court finds substantial evidence to support the claim that the transfer was incomplete and that Mr. Clark retains rightful ownership. Her gavel struck. The sound echoed through my bones like a bell calling something home. Liam stood suddenly. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You can't just walk in here," and the judge cut him off with a look. Olivia didn't move. She stared forward, blank, her hands folded tightly on the table. I stood slowly. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just breathed. After months of silence, months of planning, I had spoken the only way that mattered in proof, in law, in stillness that couldn't be shaken. Outside, the air felt different, crisper, lighter. Ellen walked beside me. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I replied, but I knew the next step was mine alone. 1 week after the court ruling, I stepped back into the house. My house. The key still turned in the lock like it remembered me. The hinges creaked just the same. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The rooms were hollow. Furniture remained, but the warmth was gone. There were no shoes at the door, no family photos on the mantel, no echoes of laughter in the hallway. Just silence. A silence I once feared. Now it simply felt honest. I walked slowly from room to room, running my hand along the banister I'd sanded myself years ago, passing the spot where Liam once fell and split his lip as a kid. I remembered sitting on that very stair, pressing a towel to his chin while he cried. Mary had been in the kitchen, her voice singing along to the radio. That was the last time this place had felt like something more than walls. I reached the living room. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, softening the corners of the space. The wine stain on the rug was still there, a remnant of a Thanksgiving long past, when Liam had laughed too hard at a joke and spilled his glass. Back then, I had smiled even as I scrubbed it clean. Now it was just a mark. Not of joy. Just evidence of time. I sat on the couch, letting the cushions absorb the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime building a home, only to be thrown from it by the very person he built it for. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply let the moment settle like dust returning to the shelves. Ownership had returned to me, but the sense of belonging hadn't. And I realized as I looked around at the empty house that maybe it never truly would. Later that day, I called a realtor, a woman named Teresa. She had a voice like gravel and kindness rolled into one. She didn't ask questions when I said I wanted to sell. Just said I'll come by tomorrow with the paperwork. I told her to bring a for sale sign too. There was no hesitation in my voice. The decision had already bloomed inside me the moment I stepped through that door. This house had held too much love, then too much betrayal. It didn't need to hold me any longer. That night, I didn't sleep in the master bedroom. I didn't even open the door. Instead, I took one last walk through the halls, stopping briefly in each room, saying goodbye in silence. Not to the furniture, not to the house, but to the man I had been when I lived here, hopeful, trusting, maybe even naive. That version of me deserved closure, and I gave it to him one step at a time. When I stepped outside, the wind felt cleaner somehow, lighter. I looked back once, not with longing, but with peace. Then I locked the door, slipped the key into my pocket, and walked away. Not just from a house, but from a history that no longer owned me. Teresa showed up the next morning, right on time, portfolio in hand heels, clicking against the sidewalk, with a rhythm that suggested she'd done this 100 times. She walked the property with the eyes of someone who saw potential, not history. I admired that. While I stood in the foyer tracing every memory carved into the walls, she measured the square footage and noted how the afternoon light hit the east-facing windows. "It's a strong listing," she said. "Good neighborhood. Mature trees. Quiet street. I'll get you a few offers by next week." I nodded. I won't be holding out for a bidding war. Just fair and clean. She looked at me, then sensing something beneath the words. But to her credit, she didn't press. She handed me a folder with glossy forms and a pen that wrote like glass. Signing the first page felt strange, like watching myself hand over something sacred. But the second page felt easier. By the third, I knew I was doing the right thing. It wasn't just a sale, it was a release. Later, back in my small apartment, I sat at the wobbly table and pulled Mary's letter from the wooden box. I hadn't read it again since the night before the hearing, but now her words seemed louder. "You gave everything to our son. Don't let the world convince you that makes you weak." That line used to feel like comfort. Now it felt like a verdict. I had been strong, but not because I fought. Because I let go. The apartment was brighter than usual. The sun had found its way through the dusty blinds, scattering soft gold across the floor. I stood and opened the window, letting the air in. A breeze lifted the corner of my notepad, revealing the line I'd written weeks ago, "I am not broken." I stared at it for a long time before adding a second line beneath it, "I am becoming." Ellen called later that afternoon. "I heard from the court," she said. "They've finalized everything. Your name is the only one on record now. Liam can't contest it anymore." I let the silence hang before answering. "Thank you for standing with me through it." Her voice softened. "You stood with yourself first. I just held the line beside you." We talked a while longer. About the sale, about the next steps. She mentioned a trip she'd been putting off, visiting her daughter in Chicago. "It's time," she said. "We've both been healing in our own corners. Maybe it's time to start living outside the fight." After we hung up, I stared out the window, watching people pass, some alone, some with kids, some walking dogs or holding grocery bags. Ordinary lives untouched by courtrooms or inheritance or betrayal. I didn't envy them. I just understood them now. Before bed, I lit a small candle and placed it beside Mary's photo. I whispered, "I'm all right." Then I turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and pulled the blanket over my shoulders. I didn't think about the past or the people who once lived in that house. I thought about where I might go next, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I felt free. The house sold faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, an offer came through well above what I'd asked. A young couple, newly married, looking to raise a family. When Teresa told me, I didn't hesitate. "Accept it," I said. "Let it go." The paperwork was signed, sealed, and filed before I had time to second-guess the ease of it all. I'd spent years building that house, years grieving the loss of what it once held. Now it was someone else's future. That thought didn't sting. It felt right. With the proceeds, I settled every remaining debt. Paid off Ellen for her services, though she tried to refuse more than once. "David," she said, "you paid me in something more valuable purpose." I insisted. She accepted. We met one last time at the diner, the same vinyl booth where we'd drawn out timelines and pieced together strategy like generals over a war map. This time there were no papers, no tension. Just coffee, 2 plates of eggs, and silence that didn't need filling. "You ever been to Europe?" she asked, dabbing her napkin at the corner of her mouth. I shook my head. Always meant to. Mary and I used to dream about it. Rome, Paris, Venice. But then life got practical. She reached into her purse and slid a small guidebook across the table. The cover read, "Rome in 14 days. Start here," she said. "I'm visiting my daughter next month. You should go somewhere that isn't survival." I looked down at the book. The pages were worn at the corners, soft from use. It wasn't new. It had been lived and trusted. I ran a finger along the spine and closed it gently. Maybe it's time. That night I sat in my apartment and searched for flights. Just out of curiosity, I told myself. But when I saw the dates, the prices, the open seats, I booked one. Non-refundable. One way. Portland to Paris. I didn't tell anyone. I just circled the date on my calendar in thick black ink. 3 weeks from now. Enough time to pack. Enough time to say goodbye to everything quietly. In the days that followed, I emptied my apartment of everything but a single suitcase and the small wooden box with Mary's letter inside. I kept her photo too, now placed in a slim leather travel wallet. On the last night before my flight, I took a walk through the city. Not the familiar neighborhoods where memories clung to corners, but somewhere new. A place I'd never had reason to go. The streets were lit with warm cafe lights. A violinist played on the corner. I dropped a bill into his case without saying a word. When I returned home, I sat one last time at my kitchen table. The chair creaked. The radiator hummed. But the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like permission. I pulled out my notebook and wrote 3 final lines I gave. I lost. I lived. Then I closed it and left it behind, tucked into the drawer for whoever came next. The airport smelled of coffee and jet fuel. I moved through it like a man out of time, suitcase rolling behind me, passport in my coat pocket, and a strange lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in decades. Security lines, boarding passes, overhead announcements crackling through the air. It all should have felt chaotic, but to me it felt like shedding skin. With every step I was walking away from the past, not to escape it, but to honor what had come through it. When the plane lifted off the tarmac and Portland faded into a mosaic of streets and trees, I looked out the window and whispered something I hadn't said in a long time. Thank you. Not to anyone in particular, just to the universe maybe, or to Mary for holding me steady through all the moments I thought I would break. Paris greeted me with gray skies and rain that felt familiar in the best way. I took a taxi to a modest apartment I'd rented near the Seine. 4th floor, no elevator, but the view made up for it, a patchwork of rooftops, chimneys, and distant church bells ringing like they still meant something. I unpacked, slowly placing Mary's photo on the nightstand and her letter in the drawer beside the bed. Then I stepped outside, coat buttoned high, and wandered without a map. The streets were cobbled, the people brisk, but not unkind. I sat at a cafe where no one spoke English and pointed at a pastry behind the glass. The waiter nodded, understanding more than just the gesture. I ate in silence, letting the sounds of the city wash over me, bikes rattling past, children laughing in the distance, the faint splash of a fountain nearby. No one knew who I was. No one cared. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't defined by what I'd given up. I was defined by what I had chosen. The days blurred in the best possible way. Museums, river walks, sitting in parks watching old couples feed pigeons. I kept a journal, but I didn't write much. Just moments. A perfect croissant, a violinist near Notre Dame, a woman with silver hair sketching lovers on a bench. It wasn't about big revelations. It was about presence. About being a man again, not just a father, not just a name on a deed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Eiffel Tower, I found myself on a bench by the river, elbows on my knees, hands clasped. I thought of Liam not with bitterness, but with a kind of distant sorrow. I had loved him, I always would, but I no longer carried the weight of his decisions like a chain around my neck. I had survived the fracture and found something whole on the other side. I stood and walked home slowly, the cobblestones slick beneath my feet, the air full of possibility. The past hadn't disappeared. It simply no longer led the way. What lay ahead didn't need to be scripted or redeemed. It just needed to be lived. A month passed in quiet rhythm. Morning walks, afternoon reading in cafes, evenings spent watching the world go by from my small balcony in Paris. I learned to say just enough French to get by, but I never pretended to be someone I wasn't. That was the beauty of starting over this late in life, no more performance. Just presence. The money from the house stretched further than I expected. I lived modestly but well. No extravagance, no guilt. Just enough. And enough was finally more than I needed. Ellen and I exchanged a few emails. She sent photos from Chicago, her and her daughter, a small reunion after years of silence. She looked lighter, softer. Her message was short. Some broken things can still be repaired. I knew what she meant. We'd both been torn open, reshaped by betrayal, but we'd chosen to rebuild with gentler hands. She asked where I'd go next. I didn't answer yet. Not because I didn't know, but because for the first time in a long time, I was in no hurry. One afternoon, I visited a bookstore tucked into a narrow alleyway in Le Marais, the kind of place you find only by accident. The owner, an older man with thick glasses and a cat that slept on the register, greeted me with a nod. I browsed the shelves, running my fingers over the cracked spines of books I couldn't read, but somehow understood. I bought a small notebook bound in worn leather and a pen with blue ink. That night I wrote Mary's name on the first page and filled the next with everything I had never said aloud. I told her I had kept my promise, that I had given everything I had to raise our son, that I had loved him in every way I knew how, and that when the time came to fight for myself, I had done it without hate. That I had let go not because I was defeated, but because holding on was the true prison. I wrote until the candle burned low and my hand ached from remembering. In the weeks that followed, I traveled. Rome, Florence, a small village in the south of France where no one asked where I came from or why I was alone. I stood in old churches and walked quiet beaches and sat in silent museums, watching history whisper through the stone. I didn't feel like a man escaping something. I felt like a man returning to himself. On the final night of winter, I found myself on a train to nowhere in particular. The countryside outside the window blurred into dusk. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out Mary's photo. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just looked at her and smiled, and for the first time in years, it wasn't tinged with sadness. The next stop was unknown, but I was ready for it. In the end, this story was never about revenge. It was about remembering who I was before the world tried to write me out. I learned that justice doesn't always roar. It sometimes arrives in silence, in stillness, in a signed paper that reclaims a name. I let go of the house of the anger, even of the version of my son I once knew. And in that release, I found peace. If you've ever been cast aside by those you raised or loved, know this: you are not broken. You are becoming. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to reclaim yourself after being erased? Share your thoughts below, and thank you for listening.